have likely been told that the British Empire conquered India. You have been taught that the British government, with its redcoats and its Union Jacks, marched into Delhi and seized the throne. But that is a myth. The British government did not seize India. A corporation did. It was a single, unregulated joint stock company operating out of a small office in London with fewer than 40 permanent staff. It had no official mandate to rule. It was not a state. It was a business. And yet this business would eventually command a private security force of 260,000 men, an army twice the size of the British Royal Army. It would generate nearly half of the world's trade. And it would execute what historians now call the supreme act of corporate violence in world history. We are talking about the East India Company, and the story of its rise is not just a history lesson. It is a warning. It is the original story of too big to fail. Welcome to Distilled. Today we are distilling The Anarchy, the relentless rise of the East India Company by the historian William Dalrymple. Part 1. Introduction. This book is a masterpiece of narrative history. It tells the story of how a band of Elizabethan pirates and merchants transformed themselves into the rulers of 200 million people. Dalrymple's work is exhaustive, cinematic, and terrified of the modern parallels it uncovers. He argues that the East India Company was the world's first aggressive multinational corporation, a Frankenstein's monster that escaped the control of its creators. But here at Distilled, we don't just take the author's word for it. We are going to distill Dalrymple's narrative and then cross-reference it with new papers from the Economic History Review and the Journal of Economic Literature. We will ask, was 18th century India really in a state of anarchy, or is that a colonial lie used to justify conquest? And does the economic data support the claim that the company looted India, or was it more complicated? By the end, you will have a nuanced understanding of how modern capitalism was forged in the opium fields of Bengal, and you will walk away with 3 actionable lessons on supply chain resilience that you can apply to your business today. Let's pour the first glass. This is The Anarchy. To understand Dalrymple's argument, we have to strip away our modern understanding of empire and look at the mechanism of the company. Dalrymple breaks the history down into a terrifying transformation. Insight number 1. The weaponization of the joint stock model. The first key concept is the joint stock innovation. In 1599, investing in global trade was a suicide mission. Ships were lost to storms, Portuguese galleons, and pirates. If you were a lone merchant, one shipwreck meant bankruptcy. The innovation that changed the world was the joint stock company. This model allowed hundreds of merchants to pool their capital. They bought shares. If a ship sank, they lost only their investment, not their livelihood. This is the birth of limited liability. But Dalrymple argues that this structure did something else. It severed the link between the owner and the action. The shareholders in London never saw India. They never saw the famines or the wars. They only saw the dividend check. This structure created a relentless, amoral engine for profit. The board of directors sat in the Leadenhall Street headquarters, 5 windows wide, and demanded a 10% return, regardless of the human cost. This was the first time in history that a non-state actor had the capacity to wage war for profit, and wage war they did. Dalrymple details how the company evolved from a trading entity into a fiscal military state. They realized that to trade safely, they needed forts. To man the forts, they needed soldiers. To pay the soldiers, they needed revenue, and the best source of revenue was not trade, but taxation. So they began to conquer territory, not for glory, but to secure a tax base to pay for the army that secured the tax base. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of violence fueled by the stock market. Insight number 2. The Anarchy as Opportunity. The title of the book, The Anarchy, refers to the specific geopolitical condition of 18th century India. Dalrymple paints a vivid picture of the collapse of the Mughal Empire. Following the death of the Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707, the great Mughal structure fractured. The subcontinent was torn apart by civil wars, Afghan invasions led by Ahmad Shah Durrani, and the rising power of the Maratha Confederacy. Delhi, once the jewel of the world with 2 million inhabitants, was sacked and burned repeatedly. Dalrymple argues that the East India Company did not defeat a mighty empire, they scavenged its corpse. They stepped into a power vacuum. They played rival warlords against one another. They offered their sophisticated, European-trained infantry as mercenaries to the highest bidder. The turning point was the Battle of Plassey in 1757. We often think of this as a great military victory. Dalrymple exposes it for what it was, a corporate transaction. Robert Clive, the company's commander, and a man Dalrymple describes as an unstable sociopath, didn't just outfight the Nawab of Bengal. He bought his general. The company worked with the Jagat Seths, the great Mawari bankers of India, to bribe the Nawab's army into submission. The bankers saw the company as a safer bet for their capital than the volatile Indian princes. This is a crucial insight. The British conquest was financed by Indian bankers. The company won because they were the most credit-worthy entity in a chaotic market. Insight number 3, the pillage and the bailout. The final narrative arc is the descent into looting. After Plassey, the company secured the Diwani in 1765, the right to collect tax revenue from Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Overnight, a London corporation became the sovereign ruler of the richest province in Asia. Dalrymple describes the consequences with harrowing detail. The company officers, known as nabobs, bled Bengal dry. They raised taxes even as crops failed. When the Great Bengal Famine of 1770 struck, killing an estimated 1.2 to 10 million people, 1/3 of the population, the company did not offer relief. Instead, they increased tax collection enforcement to ensure their dividends remained high. But here is the twist, and it is the most modern part of the story. The company was so corrupt, and its military expenses were so high, that despite looting India, it went bankrupt. The officers were rich, but the company was insolvent. In 1772, the company crashed, threatening to take the entire British banking system with it. They went to the British Parliament and said effectively, "We are too big to fail," and the government agreed. In 1773, the British state passed the Regulating Act, granting the company a massive loan of £1.4 million, the world's first mega bailout. This bailout came with a catch. The government began to take control. But to fund this bailout, the government gave the company a monopoly on tea sales to America. Yes, you heard that right. The tea that was dumped into the harbor during the Boston Tea Party was East India Company tea. The American Revolution was, in part, a reaction to a government bailout of a failing corporate monopoly. Part 2. The Deep Dive. That is Dalrymple's narrative. A rapacious corporation exploits a political vacuum, the Anarchy, loots a continent, and gets bailed out by the state. It is a compelling, almost cinematic story. But now, as promised, we have to look at the raw data. We need to cross-reference this narrative with the academic literature to see where it holds up and where we need to add nuance. Was it really anarchy? The revisionist debate. Dalrymple's title, The Anarchy, suggests that 18th century India was a chaotic wasteland before the British imposed order. However, many historians from the Revisionist School, such as C.A. Bailey and Muzaffar Alam, strongly disagree with this characterization. Actually, the data suggests that while Delhi was collapsing, the regions were booming. This is what scholars call the decentralization thesis. Studies of regional economies in Awadh, Bengal, and the Deccan show that these successor states were witnessing significant economic growth, urbanization, and trade in the 18th century. The decline of the central Mughal authority allowed local gentry and merchants to keep more of their wealth rather than sending it to the emperor. Why does this matter? Because it changes the story of the company's success. The East India Company didn't just walk into a burning building, they walked into a thriving competitive marketplace. They didn't succeed because India was failed. They succeeded because they inserted themselves into a dynamic economy and offered better terms to the financial elites, the Jagat Seths, than the local warlords did. The anarchy was not total chaos. It was a violent restructuring of power that the British capitalized on. The GDP data, the drain theory tested. Dalrymple argues the company drained India. Let's look at the macroeconomic data provided by the economic historian Angus Maddison. The numbers are stark. India went from controlling a quarter of the global economy to just 4% under British management. However, we must add a layer of complexity here. The relative decline. A significant portion of this drop was due to the explosion of the West during the Industrial Revolution. Even if India had stayed independent, its percentage share would likely have dropped as Europe industrialized. The absolute stagnation. However, the damning stat is that during the peak of company rule, 1820 to 1870, India's per capita growth was effectively 0%, while Britain's was 1.26%. The drain wasn't just theft, it was de-industrialization. The company dismantled India's textile industry to turn it into a raw material supplier for British factories. They used tax revenue collected in India to buy Indian goods for export, meaning India was effectively paying for its own exports. This is the economic definition of extraction. The military paradox, the 260,000-man army. Dalrymple claims the company had an army twice the size of the British Army. Is this accurate? Yes. Records indicate that by 1803, the company's private army totaled approximately 260,000 men. For comparison, the British Royal Army at the time hovered around 100,000 to 130,000. How could a corporation afford this? This brings us to the concept of the fiscal military state. The company paid its soldiers, sepoys, regularly and in cash, something Indian princes, who relied on land grants or plunder, struggled to do. Because the company paid on time, they attracted the best talent in the military labor market. They paid these soldiers using money borrowed from Indian bankers. The company's greatest weapon wasn't the musket, it was the bond market. They leveraged their creditworthiness to raise armies, conquer land, tax that land, and pay back the loans. It was a leveraged buyout of a subcontinent. Part 3. The application. So we have a story of a corporation that leveraged financial innovation to conquer a market, scaled too fast, committed ethical atrocities, and eventually required a massive government bailout. This isn't just history. It sounds like the headlines from 2008 or even 2023. What can the modern leader learn from the East India Company? Here is the distillate, 3 concrete lessons for today. 1. Supply chain resilience. The China Plus One is the new opium pivot. The East India Company faced a critical supply chain failure in the late 18th century. They were bleeding silver to pay for Chinese tea because China didn't want British goods. Their solution was the opium pivot. The mechanism: they realized they controlled the opium supply in Bengal. They began smuggling this opium into China to pay for the tea. It was a triangular trade: India, opium, China, silver, tea, Britain. While the ethics were horrific, creating a nation of addicts, the strategy highlights the importance of diversified trade nodes. The East India Company failed when it relied on a bilateral trade, Britain-China, that was unbalanced. It succeeded when it introduced a third node, India. Audit your supply chain today. Are you relying on a simple bilateral flow, e.g., buying chips from Taiwan? If that link breaks, do you have a third node? Modern companies are moving to a China Plus One strategy, establishing manufacturing in Vietnam or India to create a triangular resilience. Don't just rely on your primary supplier, control the input to your supplier if possible. 2. The governance trap: beware the imperial CEO. Dalrymple describes figures like Robert Clive and Warren Hastings as imperial CEOs, executives operating with almost zero oversight due to the communication lag between London and Calcutta. The directors in London could not control the actions of their executives in the field. This principal-agent problem led to wars and corruption that benefited the executives personally. Clive became the richest man in Europe, but bankrupted the company. Distance destroys governance. In the 18th century, distance was physical, 6 months by sea. Today, distance is informational. Boards often don't understand the complex financial instruments or algorithms their star CEOs are using, think Enron or FTX. If you sit on a board or run a team, demand radical transparency on the source of profits. If a division is posting outsized returns, like Clive's looting, investigate the sustainability of that revenue. If the profit comes from exploiting a loophole or a Wild West environment, it is a liability in waiting. 3. Political risk. The state always wins. The ultimate fate of the East India Company is the most important lesson. In 1858, following the Indian Mutiny, the British Crown nationalised the company. It was dissolved. As the consultancy Baron Public Affairs notes in their analysis of the East India Company, business leaders who assume policy-making powers invite the wrath of the ultimate monopolist, government. The East India Company forgot it was a business and tried to be a state. Corporations can be powerful, but they cannot be sovereign. When a company challenges the state's monopoly on power, whether through private armies in 1800 or creating private currencies just Libra in 2020, the state will eventually crush it. Stay in your lane. If your business model relies on replacing government functions, like infrastructure or currency, without explicit partnership, you are inviting a regulatory crackdown. The East India Company shows us that too big to fail eventually becomes too big to exist. Part 4. Conclusion. So, to distill it all down, the East India Company was the original unicorn. It used the joint stock model to hack the global economy, leveraged the anarchy of a decentralizing India to seize power, and built a military-industrial complex that reshaped the world. But it proved that a corporation without a conscience is a danger not just to its subjects, but to its shareholders, and ultimately to itself. If you want to read the papers we mentioned on the fiscal military state, or check the data tables from Angus Maddison, head over to the show notes. We've also linked a fascinating breakdown of the 1773 bailout and how it compares to the 2008 financial crisis. If you enjoyed this deep dive, follow, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next distillation, The Origins of the CIA. This has been Distilled.